Okay, welcome everybody to our second session in this celebratory event for the 10th anniversary of our degree program in World Politics and International Relations. I'm very pleased to have with us Richard Kaplan. Sorry, you? Matteo Alvaro, who's going to give a short presentation. Speech.
Thank you, Ian, for being the chair of the session. Welcome, everyone. I'm new to this in the sense that I've had the pleasure last year to give a welcome speech on the behalf of our rector, who couldn't be here, introducing Fausto Pocar, and has been a great pleasure for me to also stay and enjoy his lecture. And today is an even greater pleasure to be here and, well, first of all, see a lot of students, a lot of young people here, which is, after the challenge we faced in the past couple of years, it's quite a pleasure. And it's a pleasure because we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of what I think is a flagship for our institution when we talk about masters. The World Politics and International Relations is a multidisciplinary program of study who thought about it, decided to put together in line with the Italian and French tradition of political sciences, all different disciplines in one master. And to me, this is, what I always consider the progress in teaching. The interesting part is that the master hosts over 60% of non-Italian students, which is also a great achievement. And after 10 years, we can finally count the success of this master, who started in 2012, 2013, I hope I got the numbers right, with 17 students. And 5 years later, you were 33 people, and now it counts over 60 students after a very tough and selective choice of people. So I welcome you all on the behalf of our rector, and I hope you will enjoy a great anniversary for the master. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. And now I'm going to hand over to Marco Clementi, who is the coordinator of the degree program, and he's going to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Matteo, for your welcome address. Hello, everyone. It is a privilege to introduce Professor Kaplan to the WPIR students, to the colleagues of the Department of Political and Social Sciences and of the University of Pavia. I will just take a few minutes to introduce Professor Kaplan, because I know that you are all looking forward to listening to his special lecture for this celebration. Richard Kaplan is Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford and former director of the Center for International Studies of the same university. He is an official fellow of Linnaeus College, and before the appointment, he served at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and in London at the University of Reading. He has been a visiting professor at several prestigious universities, such as the European University Institute, Sciences Po, Princeton University, and the University of Constance, and others. He has also been the editor of the World Policy Journal, one of the top foreign policy publications in the United States, Professor Kaplan has extensively published on various research topics, including international organizations and conflict management, with a particular focus on peacekeeping and post-conflict peace and state building, nationalism and ethno-nationalist conflict, and contemporary European security. Let me just mention some, at least 3, of the many books he has written or edited. 1996, Oxford University Press, Europe's New Nationalism, States and Minorities in Conflict, a book which focused on the resurgence of nationalism in Europe and the reasons why nationalism has been associated with conflict in some cases and not in others. 2005, Oxford University Press, International Governance of War-Torn Territories, Rule and Reconstruction, which is a book about the administration of war-torn countries by the UN and multinational organizations. 2019, the latest book, I'm not wrong, Oxford University Press. He also published for Cambridge University Press, actually, but I don't know why. I just picked up the one published for Oxford University Press, Measuring Peace, Principles, Practices, and Politics, a book which is devoted to answering a key research question, that is to say, how do we know that the peace that has been established following a civil war is a stable one, is a stable peace. Now, I believe, everyone believes Professor Kaplan's scientific and professional profile is so varied and rich that it cannot be encapsulated in a few words. Nevertheless, let me emphasize at least three aspects that cannot go unmentioned. The first relates to the crucial relevance of the topics that Professor Kaplan has studied. If you want, you could take his works to draw up a list of the great problems of our time and of the keywords of contemporary IR literature and research. Some of them: nationalism, ethnic conflicts, failing states and state building, peace building and international administration, humanitarian intervention. The second aspect relates to Professor Kaplan's rare ability to combine sharp theoretical analysis with original and rigorous empirical research to produce innovative visions. Consider, for example, the volume on the measurement of peace. The topic of peace, which for much international relations literature is a concept that can only be defined in the negative, namely as the absence of war, of conflict, becomes an object to be theorized not only in the positive, but also to be treated empirically, so that it can be transformed into a measurable phenomenon. The third one, the last one, relates to Professor Kaplan's concern for applied knowledge. Professor Kaplan has put a lot of effort into applying scientific knowledge to real situations, and he has collaborated intensively and continuously with numerous institutions that play a key role in contemporary international politics. In fact, he is serving, and he has served for many important national and international institutions. For instance, the World Food Programme's Peace Evidence Experts Research Group, the Select Committee on Foreign Affairs in the UK House of Commons, the United Nations Peace Building Support Office, and I could go on, but I stop here. So he has also directed, the last instance I want to emphasize, the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, which is a non-governmental organization that aims at strengthening the flow of credible and unbiased information in countries in conflict, which I think is a thing of the utmost importance. I do not need to comment why. So to conclude my welcome address, Professor Kaplan is one of the figures to look to for guidance in thinking about the issues affecting our time. We are indeed lucky to have the opportunity to listen to him and to be able to dialogue with him. And I thank him personally and as the coordinator of the Master Program in World Politics and International Relations for being here with us today and for giving this special inaugural lecture. Thank you very much.
Marco, thank you for the very, very generous comments and also for the very warm reception that I've received. It's a real pleasure to be here, my first time in Pavia, and I'm impressed with, well, everything I've seen thus far, the city, the university, and what I've come to learn about this excellent master's program now in its 10th year. And to the students who are in attendance, I think you're really very fortunate to have the opportunity to study here, to participate in this truly excellent program. And I hope that you will enjoy your time here and that you will go on to many successful careers as your predecessors on this program have done. When I was first invited to give this lecture, we were inhabiting a very different world, a world in which naked aggression seemed to be largely, if not entirely, a relic of the past. Of course, Russia's invasion, I should say further invasion of Ukraine in February of this year changed all that. And one consequence of these events has been an exceptionally widespread demonstration of solidarity with Ukraine in opposition to Russia's actions. And that seemed to render my idea for this lecture on current challenges to multilateralism obsolete. Was multilateralism really facing serious challenges? The Ukraine crisis seemed to breathe new life into multilateralism. But when I reflected further, I came to the conclusion that the challenges I wanted to discuss in many ways were still salient. Why? The reason is because I think it's important to distinguish between the multilateralism born of a major and immediate, really cataclysmic crisis, which the response to Putin's aggression represents, and the more quotidian, everyday multilateralism beyond Ukraine. The former is exceptional, and when the exceptional fades, and I'm confident that it will eventually, the everyday will remain. In other words, there will continue to be fundamental challenges for multilateralism, and this is what I wanted to discuss today. Now, if we look beyond the collective response to the Ukraine crisis, which by the way is not a universal, undifferentiated response, it is evident that we're living in challenging times for multilateralism. In the United Kingdom, where I work and reside, the agony of Brexit, the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union, posed and continues to pose its own set of challenges for multilateralism in Europe and more widely. In Brazil, a strong proponent historically of multilateralism among emerging nations, multilateralism under Bolsonaro has taken a backseat to a Brazil first policy that's abandoned any pretense of global responsibility for the protection of the Amazon. In Russia, as was already evident before the Ukraine crisis, support for multilateralism was often being used as a vehicle for advancing narrow national interests over broader organizational goals and purposes. And everywhere in the world, the assault on the multilateral system by the US government under the presidency of Donald Trump was dramatic and, in some respects, unprecedented. I could go on. My examples are only meant to be illustrative. Sadly, they are not exhaustive. It's important to distinguish the assault on multilateralism from other adverse trends that we're witnessing at the same time, in particular, the rise in authoritarianism. The year 2021 marked the 16th consecutive year of decline in global freedoms, according to the US think tank Freedom House. A total of 60 countries, 60 countries, suffered declines in freedom over the past year by Freedom House's reckoning. Similarly, the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index for 2021 reveals that democratic rights around the globe are at their lowest ebb since that survey was first launched in 2006. Of the 167 countries that the Economist Intelligence Unit surveyed in 2021, only 21 were, in their estimate, full democracies, while more than 1/3 of countries living under authoritarian regimes. Now, it's important to distinguish authoritarianism from challenges to multilateralism because authoritarianism is not necessarily incompatible with multilateralism. Russia, for example, an autocratic regime, managed to square this circle in the past. Prior to the Ukraine crisis, Russia was a proponent of a rules-based multilateral order in many respects and in many respects it still is. It might seem hard to believe today, but when Putin and other senior Russian officials expressed their support for the central role of the United Nations, they weren't just paying lip service to multilateralism. The United Nations has long been an important forum for Russia. As a veto-wielding permanent member of the Security Council and as a formidable military power, Russia has exercised a lot of influence there, which it very much values. Russia may not have exercised that influence in support of democratic freedoms and human rights, but nor did it seek a world in which there were no multilateral constraints on power, other nations' power, that is, however weak those constraints might have been. And many other authoritarian regimes, China most notably, have supported multilateralism for similar reasons. None of these countries wants to live in a jungle. They want a rule-based international order. Another distinct but associated trend, which you may or may not judge to be adverse, is anti-globalization. Now, to the extent that globalization is responsible for, or at least perceived to be responsible for, growing inequality at home and abroad, as well as other ills such as the erosion of sovereignty and loss of national identity, it's contributed to hostility towards multilateral institutions because it's these institutions, especially in the economic sphere, that have been the engines of globalization. But here too, while it's tempting to conflate the two, the assault on globalization and the assault on multilateralism, the two need to be distinguished because globalization, in the way that we've experienced it, is not an inevitable outgrowth of multilateralism. Indeed, multilateral institutions can actually mitigate some of the risks, some of the worst effects of globalization, including inequality, with appropriately designed institutions or interventions. For instance, support for quality education, health policies, progressive taxation, early childhood development, as the World Bank has sought to do, at least with some of its programs. However, it's fair to say that historically, inequality-sensitive approaches to globalization have not been the dominant trope among multilateral development institutions, and certainly not among multinational corporations. Now, although I've been talking about the challenges for multilateralism as a matter of concern, we need to remember that multilateralism is not necessarily, in all cases, a good thing. The 1956 invasion of Egypt by Britain, France, and Israel erupting in the Suez Crisis was an act of multilateralism, and it was not a good thing, and not just because it failed. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, led by the United States, Britain, Australia, and Poland, was also an act of multilateralism, and it too was not a good thing. Now, you may have different judgments of these undertakings than I do, but I think you can agree that sometimes, in some cases, multilateralism is a cover for great powers to do not so great things that they would find awkward to do entirely on their own. And that's because multilateralism confers varying degrees of legitimacy on states' actions, even if that legitimacy is sometimes only paper thin. Now, it's worth pausing to reflect on the basis of that legitimacy. If we're being cynical about it, we can ask, is a crime syndicate made up of many parties any more legitimate than a lone criminal? Obviously not. So partly it's a question of the normative basis of any multilateral effort. Multilateral undertakings conducted by illegal means or for illegal ends often suffer from a legitimacy deficit in the court of world opinion. Now, there are exceptions. The NATO bombing of Serbia in support of Kosovo in 1999 was, in the words of the Independent International Commission for Kosovo, illegal but legitimate. Illegal because NATO member states deployed force without the authorization of the UN Security Council and therefore in violation of the UN Charter, but legitimate because, one, all diplomatic avenues had been exhausted, two, there appeared to be no other way to stop the mounting killings and atrocities in Kosovo at the time, and three, because NATO is a regional organization made up of democratic states, all of whom supported the action in the interest of preventing an imminent humanitarian catastrophe and a regional conflagration. Now, of course, not all states shared this view, and not all of you may share this view. Russia in particular seized upon the illegality of this action at the time and ever since, and we can perhaps dismiss the criticisms of Russian officials as self-serving. Indeed, Putin would later go on to invoke the Kosovo precedent as justification for his actions in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014. But Kosovo was a shock not only to Russian officialdom, but also to Russian intellectuals of a more liberal internationalist bent. Now, I have in mind intellectuals such as Vladimir Baranovsky, former deputy director of IMEMO, the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, an independent-minded analyst who has written eloquently and forcefully about the Kosovo effect on Russian foreign policy. What was NATO doing? He and like-minded liberal internationalist Russians have wondered, using force out of area and without the authorization of the UN Security Council to defend a secessionist entity. That's how it looked to them. Now, I think it's a mistake to view Russian invocations of the Kosovo precedent as entirely self-serving. However, what these invocations fail to acknowledge is the imminent humanitarian catastrophe that we were facing in Kosovo, circumstances that even Russia acknowledged at the time, but which today Putin might be inclined to dismiss as fake news. But in short, what I'm trying to say is that the normative underpinnings matter, although they may not always enjoy universal appreciation. Now, there's another aspect of multilateralism that underpins its legitimacy. Multilateralism can often, but will not always, exert restraint on the agents engaged in cooperative endeavor. And an indirect example of this is the unification of Germany at the end of the Cold War. What was it that facilitated the acceptance of German reunification? Not only on the part of the Soviet Union, but also on the part of Britain and France. And just read Margaret Thatcher's and Francois Mitterrand's memoirs to appreciate the depths of their anxiety at the time about German reunification. But to paraphrase the late John Ruggie, the scholar, what facilitated the acceptance of German reunification was the recognition that a united Germany, firmly anchored in a matrix of European multilateral organizations, would pose far less of a security threat than a neutral Germany tugged in different directions in the center of Europe. And it was the same restraining influence of European multilateralism that appealed to a united Germany, mindful that in the absence of such a matrix, of such an anchor, the past would cast a long and potentially ominous shadow over the rest of Europe and fail to reassure its neighbors. Now, of course, the restraining powers of multilateralism can be very limited. One is hard-pressed to see how much restraint the allies associated with the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, Tony Blair in particular, exerted on the US in the lead up to the invasion. Despite Blair's explicit appeals to George Bush to seek authorization from the UN Security Council for the use of force against Saddam Hussein, the elusive second resolution, Bush chose to ignore those appeals from his closest ally and instead sought to exploit the legitimacy inherent in a multilateral campaign. Now, it's worth noting that some multilateral institutions have inbuilt restraints, as with the requirement for unanimity for decisions taken by NATO or the EU, and this feature has clearly influenced the actions of those organizations on some occasions. Now, with regard to multilateral's limitations, let's not forget that international cooperation, the defining feature of multilateralism, international cooperation does not eliminate or even override international competition, for better and for worse. And we've seen evidence of this in the efforts to fight the COVID pandemic. At the same time that scientists of all nationalities across the globe were working together to produce a vaccine, states were vying with each other to be the first in line to obtain these vaccines for their own populations, what's been described as vaccine nationalism. The multilateral organization that should have been coordinating international efforts to produce a vaccine, the World Health Organization, was forced to redesign its global COVID-19 vaccine procurement facility known as COVAX because rich and powerful states were favoring bilateral deals over support for the facility, which was created to ensure an equitable distribution of vaccines worldwide. And this, by the way, was the same multilateral organization that the Trump administration announced in July 2010 that the United States would be withdrawing from, thus threatening to deprive it of vital funding, some 22% of its core budget, at a time when the world was facing one of the most serious health crises in the organization's history, indeed in the world's history. This announcement followed earlier decisions by the Trump administration to withdraw the United States from UNESCO, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the Open Skies Treaty on Overflight Reconnaissance, among other multilateral accords. Now, I've been describing challenges to multilateralism. It's important, however, to bear in mind that not all challenges to multilateralism have originated from without, from outside. Multilateralism, as it's been practiced, has sometimes carried within it its own seeds of decay. In her most recent book, the political scientist Vivian Schmidt dissects the Europeans' crisis of legitimacy, as she calls it, pinpointing the European Union's preoccupation with rules rather than with the welfare of its member states, to explain why the European crisis from 2009 so seriously tarnished the EU's reputation and weakened support for the organization, weakening from which it really probably hasn't recovered. Others have decried the EU's democratic deficit, the fact that the European citizens do not feel that they're adequately represented in European decision-making, and that the EU is insufficiently accountable. In a survey of European countries that was taken in 2018 by the Pew Research Center, an average of 62% of those surveyed, that's nearly 2/3, said that the European Union, and I'm quoting, does not understand the needs of its citizens. That's not a pretty picture. Could be argued, however, that some of the disruptions of multilateralism that we're witnessing are only momentary, that with the passing of the Trump administration, for instance, we're witnessing a reversal of the US retreat from multilateralism. With the election of Joe Biden as US president, his administration has certainly taken a less unilateralist approach to international relations. America is back, Biden announced after soon taking office in 2021. Indeed, in one of his first acts as president, Biden retracted Trump's decision to withdraw from the World Health Organization. But the problem is that some of the damage to multilateralism has already been done and will not be easy to reverse. Take arms control. Having dismantled some of the pillars of the international architecture that's helped to keep nuclear peace regionally and globally, the United States is not finding it easy to put those pillars back into place. For instance, the United States has been seeking to rejoin, to rehabilitate the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that the Obama-Biden administration negotiated and that Trump repudiated, the deal that arguably helped to restrain Iran from the development of a nuclear arsenal. But it may simply be too late. It's not clear that Iran wishes to reaffirm its commitment to an arrangement that is predicated on the goodwill of its signatories after the United States failed to honor its commitments. Similarly, the US withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which for 3 decades constrained the United States and Russia from deploying short and intermediate range nuclear missiles in Europe, represents another fatal blow to a critical component of the nuclear arms control regime. It may not be easy or possible at all to reverse the damage done to this regime, even without the complications arising from the Ukraine crisis. Now, however, just to round out the picture, in the age of COVID-19, at the same time that we're witnessing assaults on the multilateral system, we've also witnessed stepped up support for multilateralism, including in unexpected corners of the world. Israel and Palestine provided an encouraging example of this in the early stages of the pandemic, as a recent study by the Israeli Institute for National Security Studies has observed, and I'm quoting now from that study, the pandemic underscored the mutually dependent relations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, the PA. Realizing that the collapse of the PA would have a dire impact on its own security, Israel expended unusual and significant efforts to help the PA face the coronavirus threat. During the first wave of the pandemic, both sides jointly implemented practical measures to keep the situation under control at home and next door. These measures included coordination between the ministries of health of the PA and Israel. Joint training sessions for medical personnel were organized, and information and medical supplies were distributed to the Palestinian public by Israel. Extra funds were released by Israel to the Palestinian Authority, and in joint coordination, tens of thousands of Palestinian workers were permitted to remain in Israel to continue working under certain conditions. And the report concludes the COVID-19 pandemic is a clarion call for environmental-based threats requiring coordination across jurisdictions to mitigate threats to national health, prosperity, and security. And in a similar vein, and I discussed this with some of the students on the program yesterday, with Oxford colleagues, I've been engaged in efforts to promote greater coordination and cooperation among Israel, Palestine, and Jordan with regard to the management of natural resources, energy and water in particular, that are coming under increased pressure as a consequence of climate change. There is a growing recognition in the region, perhaps not growing fast enough, that siloed national policies are simply inadequate to meet the challenges that global warming is generating, and that greater regional cooperation, even integration, will be required to achieve environmental sustainability. Now, it's evident from what I've been saying that if the challenges to multilateralism are real, so too are the prospects for meeting those challenges, even among adversaries. So what can be done to strengthen multilateralism? One of the curious things is that despite what some national leaders may be saying against multilateral efforts and against multilateral institutions, public opinion in support of multilateralism, and the UN system in particular, is often high, and in some quarters has been consistently so for many years, well before Trump was elected and throughout his time in office. According to the Pew Research Center, across 32 countries surveyed in 2019, an average of 61% expressed a positive view of the United Nations, while an average of just 26% expressed a negative view. So a very distinct minority. That's a significant level of support. In the United States specifically, nearly 60% of those surveyed expressed a favorable opinion of the UN. You wouldn't know that from the statements coming out of the White House under Trump. A separate poll conducted on behalf of the Better World campaign in September 2020 found that a whopping 85% of Americans surveyed expressed the view that the United Nations is either very important or somewhat important, with 73% maintaining that it's an organization that's still needed today. Similarly, when surveyed about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 2019, again, well before the Ukrainian crisis, 77%, or nearly 8 in 10 Americans, said that being a member of NATO is good for the United States. These votes of confidence in multilateralism are not just a recent phenomenon. It's been a pattern for many, many years, at least in the United States. Now, what these figures tell us is that the assault on multilateralism is often not driven in response to popular demand. Public on the whole is not hostile to multilateralism. To the contrary, there's popular support for multilateralism. Part of the problem is that whether viewed favorably or not, The work of international organizations, especially their achievements, is not always well known or well enough understood, nor is their importance appreciated as a consequence. Multilateral organizations often do a bad job of communicating to the general public about what they do, and the media do not give them much attention either, or when they do, they give these multilateral institutions a disproportionate amount of bad press. And I'm not suggesting that they don't deserve criticism, but I think that on balance, the coverage is rather negative. Another problem is that while the general public may be favorably disposed toward multilateralism, increasingly it is a partisan issue. So in the United States, for instance, surveys show that Democrats tend to have a more positive view of the United Nations than Republicans do. And that partisan gap has been growing year on year. Partisan divide makes public opinion more susceptible to manipulation. And I think that is what you're seeing in the United States. This probably explains the lack of public appreciation, or in part explains the lack of public appreciation for the work of the World Health Organization, which Trump railed against during the pandemic. According to the Pew Research Center again, the US public gave lower marks to the World Health Organization for its pandemic response than it did to its own national health authorities, despite evidence of very significant problems associated with the management of the pandemic at both the state level and the federal levels of US government. When polled in April and May of 2020, 72% of US adults surveyed said national public health officials were doing a good job of dealing with the pandemic, whereas just 46% of Americans gave the World Health Organization positive marks. Now, does this reflect a lack of understanding of what the WHO does, or was it evidence of Trump's negative messaging getting through to the public, or a combination of the two? Now, if the problem in part is a lack of understanding, one thing that can be done to address the problem is to develop ways of increasing public awareness of the work of the United Nations, the European Union, and other multilateral institutions. Now, I appreciate that this is no easy task, and if only the answer were to produce more academic studies on the multilateral system, we academics could look forward to getting a much better return on our grant applications, that's for sure. But on a more serious note, maybe this is where our primary and secondary schools could be doing a better job. Target 4.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, call for the mainstreaming of what it calls global citizenship education in national education policies, curricula, teacher education, and student assessment. I don't know what it's like in Italy, but I know that in England, where I live, international institutions get very little attention in education in secondary schools, primary and secondary schools. There are model United Nations, but these tend to be extracurricular activities. So this is one way that awareness could be increased if there was greater inclusion of some content on international institutions in the schooling of our children. Another idea that's gaining traction is the notion of inclusive multilateralism. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres first used the term in his address to the General Assembly in 2019. If multilateral institutions seem remote and out of touch with the public, he stated, then more needed to be done to include the public in the work of these organizations. That means, he said, closer contacts with businesses, civil society, and other stakeholders. Now, how might this be achieved? Digital technologies today offer unprecedented opportunities for various constituencies to weigh in on a whole host of issues, as the pandemic made clear. But to be effective, these constituencies need to feel that their voices genuinely matter. And the difficulty is that governments are often reluctant to yield meaningful space to non-state actors. Formal participation in intergovernmental organizations, however, is not the only way to influence the work of these organizations. We've seen a flourishing of joined up civic action across the globe in recent years against racism, against climate change, against sexual violence. And many of these efforts have had considerable effect on multilateral efforts. in a multilateral world characterized in part by rival conceptions of international order, the case is also being made increasingly for exclusive rather than inclusive multilateralism. It's been suggested by Princeton political scientist John Eikenberry, among others, that liberal states should build exclusive clubs to advance their shared interests with respect to democracy, human rights, free market economy. Their shared vulnerabilities as open societies also offer reasons for these states to cooperate. Advocates of exclusive multilateralism don't deny the need for large inclusive multilateral institutions to address certain issues, for instance, climate change and other global public goods, but at a time when the liberal order is under strain. I mean, just think of the paralysis which has seized the UN Security Council in the context of the Crimean and the Ukraine and as well the Syrian crisis. They maintain that the large inclusive multilateral institutions can no longer deliver as well as they once did, in part because there's no longer sufficient support for the normative orientation of some of these institutions. Now, that's not a new idea, of course. The G7, the EU, and more recently, Biden's Summit for Democracy, these are all exclusive clubs whose membership is determined in part by a commitment to a common set of values and the pursuit of objectives informed by those values. Now, variation on this approach is to build inclusive coalitions within multilateral organizations. Bruce Jones of the Brookings Institutions, for instance, has proposed that democracies should form coalitions within large multilateral institutions, such as the UN system, to advance their interests. And again, this is not a new idea. The G77, a coalition of 134 developing countries, seeks to promote its members' collective interests and create an enhanced negotiating capacity within the United Nations. Similarly, the non-aligned movement, NAM, is a group of states that do not consider themselves aligned formally with or against any major power bloc. In the past, liberal democracies enjoyed greater influence in multilateral institutions, greater influence than they do today, by default, naturally, because they were numerically superior. I mean, think back to the membership of the United Nations in the early post-war years. As a consequence, liberal democracies didn't need coalition building then to advance their interests. Jones warns, however, against overdependence on exclusive multilateral institutions like the G7 and NATO. First of all, more inclusive multilateral organizations have greater legitimacy, arguably, and they play a more important role in international agenda setting. Secondly, and being a bit pragmatic about it, many states have strategic interests that would militate against joining coalitions directly, explicitly, or implicitly against particular states. I mean, think about Japan and India, and this has been evident, especially with regard to India in the current Ukraine crisis, where it has to be very, very careful about balancing with respect to Russia because of its concerns about China. Now, does this mean that we're entering a period of competitive multilateralism with the talk about exclusive multilateralism and inclusive multilateralism? It may be the case. The pessimistic view is that multilateral institutions will become the grounds for competition between different ideals, most notably between the liberal international order promoted by liberal democracies and, on the other hand, autocratic international orders advanced by China, Russia, and others. On this reading, the establishment of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and similar initiatives represent pushback against the predominance of the West and presage the erosion of the liberal values underpinning the multilateral system. Now, in an arena that I know fairly well, peace operations, China, India, Brazil, and others have indeed pushed back on the use of force with regard to humanitarian intervention, on the responsibility to protect, and on robust peacekeeping. They've challenged the human rights elements of peace operations as well, and they've called into question the liberal model of peace and state building in favor of a more narrow developmental model. So that's the pessimistic view. The more optimistic view is that China and others are not actually seeking a fundamental break with the existing multilateral order, even with the establishment of parallel multilateral institutions. Rather, the existing multilateral order is undergoing a profound and positive change, one that might make it more effective and better adapted to the realities of the 21st century. Notwithstanding the divergences that I've noted and others between China, Brazil, other so-called rising powers on the one hand, and the liberal internationalist powers on the other hand, notwithstanding these divergences, these powers are arguably buying into existing order more than they're challenging it. Their proposed changes to the existing international order are adjustments of that order only, not radical acts of departure or overturn. What we may be witnessing is not so much the demise of multilateralism, but rather the decline of a particular type of multilateralism, epitomized by Western liberal hegemony and the concomitant international agreements and institutions set up after World War II. In all of this, we can't ignore the Ukraine crisis. What are its implications for the multilateral system? There's no doubt the crisis has delivered a serious blow to multilateralism. It's called into question the fundamental purposes of the United Nations. It's even led to calls among highly respected analysts outside the United Nations to establish a new global organization to replace the United Nations. Now, I don't set much store by such bold ideas. Within the United Nations, however, it's widely believed that some sort of reform is necessary to address the organization's weaknesses. One very interesting initiative that's already been adopted was the decision taken by the General Assembly in April, which empowered its president, the president of the General Assembly, to convene a formal meeting of all 193 members of the General Assembly within 10 working days of the casting of a veto by one or more of the permanent members of the Security Council to debate the situation with regard to which the veto was cast. And the idea behind that was to hold the permanent 5 members more accountable for their use of the veto. Now, it sounds promising, and maybe it will come to good effect, but its first use on May 26th of this year with regard to the UN resolution condemning an intercontinental ballistic missile launched by North Korea demonstrated that veto casting states are prepared to defend their positions on sometimes specious grounds. If you're interested, have a look at that particular episode. But Ukraine will not mark the end of all cooperation. I'm very confident about that. Going forward, I expect the major powers will want to see the continued functioning of the UN system and other multilateral bodies, at least in discrete areas such as humanitarianism, humanitarian aid, development, and environmental protection. And there's also evidence to suggest a willingness to deal more effectively with food and energy crises, to fight disinformation and revitalize the flagging arms control regime. My last thought, but not my last word, on preserving and reinvigorating multilateralism is the importance of leadership. Now, I know this is a hackneyed term, but if you contrast how national leaders welcomed the advent of multilateralism following World War II with the disdain or even just the disregard with which many leaders treat those same institutions today, the difference is striking. Now, it would be naive to think that the early optimism at the end of World War II could have been sustained indefinitely, but leaders set the tone for how their publics view the international institutions of which their states are members. UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali once quipped that the letters SG in his title stood not for Secretary General, but for scapegoat. And indeed, it's become very convenient for national leaders to scapegoat the United Nations and other multilateral institutions for their own failings as heads of state, thus facilitating the retreat from multilateralism that we've been observing. And again, look at Trump's rubbishing of the WHO. But there are also lots of examples of positive leadership in this regard. The question is how to promote these good practices. And even today, speaking of positive leadership, again, depending on your interpretation of events, the holding of the first meeting that could lead to the establishment of a European forum, a French initiative to create a greater unity among European states. That meeting is taking place today. So watch that space. I think that that is a very, very interesting development. Now, to conclude, multilateralism is certainly not a panacea, and multilateral organizations are certainly not without their weaknesses, some of them very serious. But it is an illusion to think that many of the advances that humanity has made, the eradication of smallpox and polio, the dramatic reduction of the ozone hole, the lifting of millions of people out of poverty, the elimination of entire classes of lethal weapons, and many, many other achievements, these could have been achieved by states acting on their own. That is an illusion. And it's an illusion to think that many of the critical challenges that lie ahead, biodiversity, cybersecurity, global warming, mass migration, arms proliferation, and the regulation of outer space, as well as, again, the spread of infectious disease, that these and others can be met without states and peoples cooperating more closely. I welcome your thoughts on that question. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Richard, for that very stimulating talk. We have a bit of time for questions. So do we have any questions? Axel Berkowski, perhaps you could come to the microphone.
Very much, Kaplan, for your presentation. I appreciate everything, well, almost everything. I would take issue with what you said, and maybe we are on the same page. You said about the democratic deficit of the European Union. Interestingly, I've heard this many, many times in China. You know, Chinese scholars coming up to me and colleagues saying, look, there's a democratic deficit in China. Sorry, yes, there's one also, but the one in the European Union, which I find very interesting. Coming out of all countries, China's, is criticizing the alleged democratic deficit of the European Union. But then again, isn't, and probably it's more of a comment, but I'm sure you're going to come back on this to me. But isn't the European Union the very definition of successful multilateralism, for one? Number two, we have the European Parliament. We vote directly for our European parliamentarians, every 4 years. Okay, but nobody does. The turnout is very, very low. It's less than 50% almost. And it's so you talk about a democratic deficit. I've seen the Pew opinion polls. Because it's almost the only game in town. Yes, and we all cite them. Yeah, but it may be true. But then again, turnout is so low. We have the European Parliament, which has been equipped with much more authority over recent years and have a much more strong impact on what is actually taking place on a European foreign policy level. So I think it's a little bit, maybe the question is now, I come to my question, sorry about being so long, is that maybe it's a little bit outdated. This democratic deficit story, I think might be outdated. Thank you.
One at a time, or?
I always think one at a time is nice.
Yeah, okay.
I think we've got time.
Thank you very much. Very thoughtful reaction. And I everything you said, take on board. I guess one could say that despite best efforts, but I'm not trying to suggest that all measures that could be taken have been taken, but despite many efforts at reform to be more responsive, more transparent, more accountable, there is still a perception among European citizens, and why is it? Sometimes, there's little that can be done. It may be in the nature of things that we care more about our own communities closer to home. So the same countries that have limited low turnout have often much higher turnout in national elections. And maybe that is a reflection of the limited penetration of the EU in visible ways in people's lives. They do not see the importance or appreciate the importance of voting, or it could be other things. I suppose we have to peel back those numbers and ask ourselves, what is it? Misperceptions, accurate understandings of how the EU operates, and are there ways, despite the difficulties, despite the inherent problems of the EU being what it is, are there ways that it can be enhanced, the legitimacy? And maybe it is an unfair criticism, and maybe the EU has done a lot, and there's little more that it might do or might be able to do. But that is certainly the opinion that many publics continue to have. As you say, yes, Pew has been conducting these polls for many years, and it has been more or less the same. I think that in this book by Vivian Schmidt, which I recommend to anybody who has an interest in questions of legitimacy about the EU, I do think that she did get at some of the problems, at least through the prism of a very specific crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, and the impact that it had on member states and on Greece in particular. So I think that, as I said, to a degree at that time, and you may say, but we've even evolved from then, the preoccupation with rules over welfare, which is putting it in very shorthand fashion, was a reasonable, in my view, criticism to level against the EU at that time. But I take your point, and thank you.
Daria Forgiolini, and please put your hand up if you want to come in after with a question.
Thank you very much for your lecture. First of all, two thoughts that also connected a bit with what Axel said. It seemed to me that you addressed it's sort of the elephant in the room, which is the repair. How do we repair reputation, which you all tend to agree that for a number of reasons, including, I think, the issue of leadership, because you didn't touch on that directly, but obviously the leadership of the United States at the beginning of the process and directly touch on that, made sure that it was a power of attraction. It was also, there were also means to satisfy that attraction. So the power of influence, but also actual power, made those options more attractive. Well, at the time, the allegiance of from the European Union onwards, really, I mean, the allegiance of the man on the street with certain institutions just so far away, even regional institutions such as the European Union, is lower and lower. So you say, okay, they think it's a good idea, but would they do anything about it? Probably it will be a different question, a different answer to that question. Would you act? Would you invest your time? Would you die for? I mean, so the direct answer, so allegiance and leadership. How do you think that the repairing process, if we think that it can be repaired, could be helped in addressing these two issues? And last, very quickly, I was very interested in the public diplomacy of international organizations, because I also teach a course in public diplomacy. And you can see there the struggle, which is, how do you promote, if you have to promote an institution and you do not have a basic allegiance, you do not have a basic key to promote it, the product, I mean, which is the label? And then you see the struggle on that level too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, maybe in reverse order with the public diplomacy, without having thought beyond some of the suggestions that I made, I do think that there are greater opportunities. I'm particularly interested in the relationship between the United States and the United Nations, partly because that's where I grew up, but also because of the disproportionate influence that the United States has in the world. still, and how important the relationship it has with the United Nations is for, I think, the effectiveness of the United Nations. And I think that there are ways in which the leadership of the United Nations can be more effective in its communications with the political leadership. There have been efforts in the past, and I'm struggling to remember which Secretary General addressed members of Congress, but came to Washington. It might have been Kofi Annan. I'm, as I said, unclear on the precise details, but I think that reaching out, coming to their turf, if you will, their home territory, speaking to them, and opening the door to dialogue, I think that went and could go a long way. I think that there was, for all the concern about actually the Trump administration's relationship with the UN, turns out that Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the UN, was a very effective and independent, independent of the Trump administration. I think that other member states, instead of, if you will, trying to quarantine what they thought was or would be a problem with the Trump administration, engaged seriously with her and tried to draw from the criticisms elements that were constructive and could potentially enhance. And indeed, there were shared concerns about, for instance, the some of the enduring peace operations without an end in sight, and how these were a very significant drag on the resources of the United Nations. So again, it's, you know, maybe this idea of meeting halfway or some way, doesn't have to be halfway, but rather than putting up walls and barriers. And I think that can contribute to bringing on board even those members of the international community who are or in a position inclined to erode these international institutions. I don't know, you know, in terms of preparing the process, we'll never be where we were after World War II. That very, it's, again, to the students, I urge you to look back on some of the either memoirs of those who were present at the creation of the United Nations, book by Stephen Schlesinger on the creation of the United Nations, I think captures very effectively that heady optimism of those early years. We'll never be there again. It's not surprising. But I do think that where leadership, where leaders are prepared and can engage in support, I think that there is scope for them to do more to strengthen the effectiveness. It's not just down to member states, leaders, and publics. The organizations themselves, this goes back in part to the first question, need to be more responsive and need to look very carefully at themselves and identify where reforms can be introduced. The real challenge for the United Nations, of course, has been to bring on board those countries that have, over the years, gained in prominence in the world scene, that are much more significant players, for whom there is not a place at the table. I mean, they remain as they were before, and always occasionally elected to the Security Council, not enjoying the role that arguably they deserve as leading economy and now powerful states on the international stage. And that's just, unfortunately, every reform effort in that regard has come to no good end. It's just been an impasse for the United Nations. And as long as that continues, I think that it's also going to contribute to the erosion of support for at least the United Nations.
Okay, I saw a hand go up over there. Would you like to come forward, please? If you could come forward, it would be better, then we can hear you.
Okay, so hello. Firstly, I would like to thank you for taking the time and to come here and give us such an enjoyable and rich session. So I would like to ask you, in the past few years, even before COVID, we've been observing the rise of the far right in many, well, in most European countries. And as we know, the far right in its core is against multilateralism and puts it in cause. And in my opinion, the European Union is not taking the necessary stance to fight this, what I deem to be as a political and mostly social crisis. So I would like to hear how you think the European Union and multilateralism can fight this. Yeah, thank you.
Well, that's a very challenging question for me and a very challenging question for Brussels. There has been a lot of talk within the EU about enhancing multilateralism, effective multilateralism. And I'm going to have to defer to those who are more expert than I am in this room on measures that the EU has taken with regard to the phenomena that you identified of far right, the rise of the far right, and the challenge that represents for multilateral institutions. I mean, I think that the best chance the EU has is to do what it does well, because it's only, I think, not through rhetoric, but through demonstration of its value that in this regard, and I suppose one can take a lesson to a limited extent anyway from NATO. I think that to a degree, at the end of the Cold War, NATO sought to reinvent itself, have a whole discussion about the appropriateness of some of the things that it chose to do in that regard. But there's, I think, no question that the crisis, the Ukraine crisis, has driven home to many statespeople the need for effective multilateral security organizations, including in this country. I mean, it's interesting how the shift on the part of Meloni, I think, with regard to NATO, for instance, hasn't really called into question, at least NATO's effectiveness. I'm in a curious, really a accidental way almost. This has been of benefit to NATO, and as I suggested, and as polls that have been taken subsequently will further underscore, NATO has gained support. I mean, look at also the increased membership as a consequence, expansion of membership as a consequence of the Ukraine crisis. So I think it's important both for the EU to be more effective where it can be, to do a better job of communicating. I think this is a fundamental weakness where it's still, I think, too much of a mystery of what EU initiatives are and how they benefit the public generally. And then, and this is where I have to confess my ignorance, I don't know how much the EU is doing or might do to address directly the threat of the rise of the right. And that gets to be, I mean, we've seen it before. When there is a transgression of fundamental values that underpin the European Union, as has happened with Viktor Orban, with Poland, the EU has acted and has been prepared to act in defense of those values. And I think that that is the right thing to do. I mean, we're talking in those cases about established governments that have been willing to row back on their commitments, on the commitments of those member states to the rules of the game as far as the EU is concerned. And that I give them credit for not backing down. It still remains to be seen who's going to prevail in all of this. But I think it would be very unfortunate. I think that that's one way to demonstrate to the public that we will remain united in support of the values that underpin this union. And we will do all that we can, employ every constitutional measure that is available to us, sanctions to challenges in the courts, to ensure that these values remain respected.
Okay, yes,
Questions are getting harder.
sorry.
The questions are getting harder.
Thank you for your lecture, Mr. Kaplan. I have a question that's a bit more specific, but probably still in your field of expertise, since we touched upon the Kosovo president a bit. And you stated that the NATO intervention was illegal, but in some way justified, to which I can agree to a certain extent, but just keeping in mind the high number of civil casualties and the destruction of civil infrastructure as well. And the entire process being followed by, in my opinion, insufficient efforts to really build a sustainable peace, which results in now having two countries that are hybrid regimes that have very, very fragile relations and face multiple difficulties in their way, both towards EU integration and international recognition in the case of Kosovo, which leads me to my question that has a bit more to do with the current war in Ukraine and how, in your opinion, or will it impact Kosovo's path towards its own international recognition, especially keeping in mind the secession and the proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Lugansk as well.
Thank you. So just to clarify, I was, of course, quoting from this independent commission when I used the term illegal but legitimate, because that was the conclusion which they reached at that time. And I accept that there is support for that, but that there's also dissenting opinion among many, many member states, not just Russia, China, India also took issue. I think that there is certainly concern of different kinds with regard to the war in Ukraine. One is with what you might call Russian meddling. I mean, we have seen Russian support for Republika Srpska and neighboring Bosnia and Herzegovina. We've seen Russian support for Belgrade and for the Prime Minister Vučić there. There is concern about encouragement on the part of Russia to pull back to undermine the interest that these states or state-led, in the case of Republika Srpska, might have as part of Bosnia and Herzegovina of joining the EU. So in other words, sowing division in the region, and how that also would support for the north of Kosovo, where there's a Serbian majority. So concern about sowing division in the region. I don't think that there's much concern about the extension of the fighting itself, the arming of Serb rebels. I think that NATO and the EU have already demonstrated that they will take whatever measures are necessary to ensure that there is not an escalation of violence in the region. I think that that's very, very clear. And so I think that the challenges that the region is facing with all of these countries now, still North Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, EU, Kosovo outside the EU, some in NATO, some not. I think that that's an internal dynamic. So, you know, the relations between Serbia and Kosovo, the so-called efforts to achieve normalization, I don't think that they're very much impacted by what's happening in Ukraine. And if anything, I think that not just the EU, but the United States have stepped up their efforts to put pressure on the leadership in the region to try to come to some agreement, but they are still at an impasse. And my worry is that this will be one of a number of international frozen crises, which will be managed with support. EU will and others continue to provide support to the region because they don't want to see a degradation of the situation, a deterioration of the situation that would lead to unrest, but that will not constitute an actual resolution of the crisis. But I just don't think that it's in its power. I mean, look at Cyprus, how long we have been living with that unresolved problem, notwithstanding all the efforts, and there have been huge efforts made on the part of the EU, on the part of the UN. And look how long it took, it's now North Macedonia and Greece to come to an agreement over what was not even an existential issue. Actually, it was the issue of the name. You could say it had implications that could have conceivably existential dimensions to them, but it was not, it wasn't about borders. And even that took effectively from 1992 until just very recently. So I think the short answer is that I think that the problems that you described, which the risks are very much in the air, it's a concern, but I think that the actual dynamics are more local than they are regional.
When in that quote, illegal but legitimate, when I, as a political philosopher, when I hear the word legitimate, I think political scientists, when they use that term, they're using it in a descriptive way, and that it doesn't mean justified. It means something like having very widespread support. What's the meaning that you attributed to it? It meant, in your view, justified.
So I think if reading the report, you will see that they came to the conclusion, the members of this commission, that there was an imminent, and this is actually the language of the UN Security Council resolution, which Russia voted, didn't oppose, whether they abstained, I don't recall, but they did not veto, which used the terminology imminent catastrophe. That was the language of the UN. They accepted that there was an imminent catastrophe. They did not, however, go further to agree to the authorization to authorize the deployment of force. But in view of the fact, that that there was this imminent catastrophe, and that we had just lived through catastrophes that had not been imminent catastrophes that have not been addressed in those early stages, and in particular, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Srebrenica, there was a concern that we were going to see a replay of those same events. Again, this is reflecting the content of the report. And in that sense, it was thought to be legitimate, that is justified, not just popularly supported, to take action to prevent this catastrophe from unfolding.
Okay, good, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Marco, do you have anything you want to say?
Maybe a short question about, you emphasized this kind of divide between the public opinion posture about multilateralism and the ruling elite. The one supporting multilateralism and the other criticizing. I believe it's a lot of counterintuitive evidence, also because many populist or authoritarian leaders are struggling for support basing on an anti-globalist agenda, fighting against the external constraints. Let's think of Trump, of course, but many others did the same. So how could you explain this popular support for multilateralism and support for those leaders who are undermining multilateralism and its basic principles? Do you have an explanation for this?
Well, I mean, I guess the easy answer is that although there may be expressions of support for multilateralism as it manifests itself in these particular ways, these are not priority concerns of the public survey. So they would not rank strengthening multilateral institutions as major concerns on their mind. I think that that's one reason why this divide, this divergence is, if you will, sustainable. But and you may have more information about this than I do. But I quote these survey findings, and at the same time, I have to confess having some skepticism. If one were to peel back those numbers and to really probe and to ask Americans in this particular case about, in concrete terms, what they would be willing to support in terms of initiatives, we might get into some trouble. I'm not really sure about that, because it might be that in general abstract terms, yes, but when it comes down to it in actual fact, very specific initiatives. This was obviously of concern to the Clinton administration when it very quickly withdrew from Somalia after that very, the killing of the US Rangers and the dragging of one of them through the streets of Mogadishu. An operation, by the way, which was not a UN operation. And of course, that distinction is lost on the public because the US does not subject its own forces to UN military command, military control. So it was its own operation, but it was in the context of UN efforts to bring peace to that region. I've often thought that if there were a UN volunteer army, which individuals of all nations could join, able-bodied men and women, sent there by their governments, but individually choosing to participate. First of all, I think there'd be a lot of support across the globe, sufficient support to be able to establish, I don't know how many battalions, which would always be subject to Security Council control. It's not something that the UN Secretary General could unilaterally decide to deploy, but there wouldn't be the same concern about putting one's own soldiers in harm's way, because of course the US doesn't even participate. France and Britain do, although the reasons for their participation sometimes have to do with historic ties to colonial ties, to post-colonial ties to these countries in question. But I think that it would increase the effectiveness of the UN, because again, soldiers trained to a common standard, first of all, under the authority of the UN, but subject to the ultimate authority, as I said, of the Security Council. And I think that there you would probably find, again, if it were presented properly, not misrepresented as sometimes US leaders have done, talking about black helicopters that the UN Secretary General has at his disposal that nobody can see, these outlandish stories, which I'm afraid many US citizens are susceptible to. But I think that this would also maybe help with that divide. It might help to bring the politicians more on board and help to close that gap between what the public says it's willing to do and what the politicians have been reluctant. But anyway, it's not an idea that originates with me. Brian Urquhart, who was a very, very senior British civil servant in the United Nations system, wrote about this years ago in the New York Review of Books, and I still think that it's deserving of serious consideration.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? No? Well, yes, we have another question. Would you like to come forward? Could you come forward, please? Because otherwise we won't hear.
Don't have a roving mic.
Hello.
I don't know that that's on.
Does it work?
I don't see the red lights.
Do I have to get close?
Do I have to turn
Okay.
one off?
No, it's okay.
It's okay.
It's okay. All right. So my question is more of a closing side, since I think everybody wants to finish at this point. So talking about multilateralism in the present time, perhaps we have many cliches already about multilateralism being sometimes inefficient, being sometimes opposed by many leaders, especially in Europe. As has been mentioned, we have the rise of anti-globalist leaders a bit everywhere. So my question would be about the future of multilateralism in general. As we may perhaps know, the future of humanity at this point is towards expansion in terms of resources. We are going to space. We are about perhaps to start what I would term the scramble for space, like the scramble for Africa in the 19th century. So my question is, perhaps if the future of multilateralism on earthly matters, shall we say, is very controversial, perhaps can we say multilateralism is the future for humanity, considering that we'll have to work together to regulate this new development in human politics and human economic cooperation in space? Thank you very much.
It's a very interesting question. And I'll just say, again, I'm out of my depth with this, but obviously there exists a regulatory framework with regard specifically to the exploitation, if you will, of space. The question is it adequate? Is it fit for purpose in view of very fast moving developments, the weaponization of space, notwithstanding again regulations with respect to that, the resources that might be accessible as the technology advances, who should be making decisions about the exploitation of those resources. I think that those are really interesting and important questions, which I think only underscore the importance of multilateralism and the relevance of multilateralism, because while it is possible, and it was a great analogy you suggested with the scramble for Africa, while a scramble for space is indeed possible, it carries with it all sorts of risks, which we could more effectively avoid if we were to engage in a more multilateral way with that regard. So thank you for that suggestion.
Okay, unless there are any other questions, then it remains for me just to say, well, first of all, thank you very much for coming and sharing your ideas with us. And secondly, I would like to present to you, since the context is the celebration of our 10th anniversary as degree program, I'd like to present you with one of our super slick world politics notebooks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And I believe there's lunch is awaiting us, or you, in 10 minutes. From now.
Is that right? Yeah.
In the Salone del Rettorato. That's that way on this floor.